Right, so welcome to the third seminar in our series. My name's Tim and I'm the Journal Manager for Frontiers in Virtual Reality. And we're working with GuestXR, a new European project that just started up in January. And Mel Slater, our chief editor, who unfortunately couldn't be here today for personal reasons, otherwise he'd be giving us a bit of a preamble before we start. So firstly, just to cover the housekeeping, I wanted to say first up that the talk is being recorded. Your GuestXR have been kind enough to host the recording of the first talk on their YouTube page. And secondly, if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button just at the bottom there, and we'll save those up for the end of the talk. So today's talk is on getting real about ethics in virtual environments, and I'm joined today by Darian Meacham and Dani Shanley from the University of Maastricht. Over to you guys.
Yeah, thanks so much, Timothy. Thanks everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure. And we're looking forward to this conversation and this talk. I should say also, it's especially nice to be here with you, my colleague, Dani. You've just completed a literature review on the ethics of virtual reality technologies, and also on the convergence of virtual reality and AI in projects like GuestXR, where our aim is to use AI within a virtual reality environment to try to facilitate pro-social group dynamics and problem-solving behavior. So I think we're going to have quite some things to talk about. At the outset, I think it's really interesting that we come at these questions, you and I, Dani, from somewhat diverse angles, and maybe not from the most obvious ones for the topic either. I'm a philosopher and a phenomenologist by background, and now I work largely in political philosophy, dealing with questions surrounding emerging technologies. So when I consider the ethics of virtual reality systems or virtual reality environments, questions about perceptual experience, embodiment, but also social and political interaction are always on my mind. And I think for you, that approach, the approach in the background is somewhat different. So maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah, sure. No, exactly. So my background is more kind of, well, I've been working recently with ideas about responsible innovation. And I guess my background is more kind of empirical ethics and science and technology studies. So really what I'm interested in is trying to kind of make sense of how philosophical notions about responsibility and value can translate really into practice. So in my PhD, for example, I looked at how ideas about responsibility in relation to new and emerging technologies have changed and evolved over the years. So from whereas we used to think really solely in terms of ideas about individual responsibility of kind of scientists and engineers, now we think more kind of iteratively about sort of ideas of how responsibility is co-produced sort of throughout the entire innovation process. So this really requires the input of interdisciplinary teams of researchers. So like we'll have working with us within GuestXR, as well as diverse stakeholders. So really now working on Guest, that's kind of what I'm interested to see is kind of how these ideas about, or what these ideas about responsibility might mean in the context of a big interdisciplinary consortium working on AI and VR. So as Darian said, together we're kind of heading up the ethics team for the GuestXR project. And today what we really wanted to do is try and offer a kind of a field guide, if you like, to at least sort of some of the territories that are sort of on this emerging continent of VR ethics. So maybe just to kind of get us started, Darian, maybe you could tell us kind of very briefly, what are we talking about when we talk about ethics?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to move the slide?
I'm trying to get it to move.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Oh, yeah. Okay. So
Great.
Let's go straight to that. There we go.
Sorry,
yeah, there we are.
One more. There we are.
And there we go.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, I mean, I think ethics has become a kind of umbrella term for addressing normative concerns within certain problem domains. So now when we talk about ethics, it really encompasses way more than just what we might imagine as traditional philosophical ethical questions, but it also includes questions about compliance, legal compliance. And of course, in this domain, GDPR really looms large in the debate, especially for us in Europe, but also deals with questions about governance and broader societal impact. So I think on the one hand, ethics sometimes risks being seen as a kind of checklist activity or activity in legal compliance. And I think that is, of course, important. And there is really a time and a place for checklists. So let's not be too down on checklists. When people talk about ethics, they always sort of say, we're not just doing checklists, but sometimes checklists are actually really helpful. But of course, we do want it to mean more than that. And I think most of the communities that we work with when we deal with the ethics of VR systems and VR environments also see a broader scope for ethical questions, broader than just legal compliance and data protection. But yeah, it's probably more accurate to talk about ethics, politics, governance, and even political economy of VR systems and VR environments. And as some of you may know, these so-called by design approaches, so ethics by design, value sensitive design, privacy by design, have become extremely popular recently. And indeed, the approach that we're applying here in the GuestXR project will hopefully be one of those, by design. And I think, Dani, you know quite a bit about that topic, so maybe it's helpful if you say in a word or two what it means or what makes something by design, or what makes that kind of approach different.
Yeah, I mean, so just very, very briefly, I mean, essentially when it comes to kind of thinking about the sorts of impacts that new technologies like AIVR have on society, we can think about regulation by means of legislation and standards, or we can also think about by design, obviously. So trying to ensure that the systems themselves are actually built according to ethical principles. So instead of kind of, waiting till we have a product at the end and then thinking about the impacts, how can we already think about that really from as early as possible in the design process? So engaging with ethics by design approaches basically means raising a lot of questions, not only about the feasibility of the proposed technology, but also its desirability. So these approaches really seek to kind of go beyond the hype that is often associated with new and emerging tech like AI or VR, in order to really ensure that we start taking decisions about responsibility seriously and really think critically about the long-term impacts that these technologies could potentially have. So I think, what makes these approaches maybe a little bit different is that they involve asking these kinds of questions, as I said, right from the very start of the innovation process, and really involving as many people as we can, as many stakeholders as we can in these kind of ongoing discussions. So is really to try and embed values that are of ethical importance throughout design and development. And I mean, these approaches obviously then give us a kind of a good starting point. They give us a good kind of roadmap, if you like, of how we might start to take responsible development seriously. But of course, they're not without their issues themselves. So, I mean, maybe Darian, how would you summarize some of the main challenges that we should consider when we use these kinds of ethics by design approaches?
Yeah, so I think there are really a few key issues that we need to bear in mind when we talk about ethics by design, value sensitive design, privacy by design. So anything we talk about by design, and I think you put it really well when you said, well, I think one of the core elements of by design is that stakeholders are involved in the process in determining what the relevant values are and how those values can be, let's say, iterated or implemented in the design process itself and in the eventual technology that comes out of the design process. But there are some big questions. And first of all, there's the question of, well, whose values are included, right? There's always going to be some level of non-inclusivity, so you can't always include every stakeholder. There's always going to be some voices that are not left out, some voices that are not as loud or not as prominent as you'd like them to be. So there are always going to be some trade-offs when we talk about these value-sensitive design processes or ethics by design processes, or when we talk about upstream stakeholder engagement. And I think, first of all, it's about understanding these challenges are always going to be there. We're never going to have a perfect process where we're able to really take into consideration and incorporate the concerns and the values of all of the relevant stakeholders. I think that's an ideal, but it's probably not going to happen. But we do need to find ways with dealing with this challenge that are constructive. So acknowledging on the one hand that there's a sort of ideal of inclusivity that we're not going to achieve. That's one important thing, but also doing these processes in an iterative way. So not just, doing one consultation, one stakeholder consultation saying, okay, great, we've understood now what's important to our stakeholders, we can move on, but thinking again and again, and also through the design process and also in the implementation process, of course, who is a relevant stakeholder changes. And I think that's an extremely important point also. So And of course, we know that there can be a kind of misalignment between what we might call design values on the one hand and actual use once an artifact like a VR environment, for example, is released into the wild. And upstream engagement in the design process is great, but this process of value alignment and also operationalization of values in the design and implementation process doesn't just end once, at the end of the design process. It's necessary to also track and to try to understand and try to have an active role in this value alignment through the lifetime of a technology or an artifact. And that really becomes not just a question about how it is we think about involving stakeholders in design processes, but also how it is we think about involving affected communities, involving stakeholders in the governance of these technologies. There is a really wonderful quote by one of my favorite, he's a sort of philosopher, sociologist, urban planner, Richard Sennett. And he writes in his book, Building and Dwelling Ethics for the City, the jaggedness between the living and the built cannot be resolved simply by the planner or developer developing ethical uprightness. So simply, I think that's really, really a telling and a wonderful statement. So simply being attentive to ethical issues, even acting upon ethical issues isn't always enough. And it's not always enough, especially when we talk about let's say the sometimes conflict or tension between the ways in which we build things, the ways in which we want to build things, and the ways in which those things that we build are lived and are experienced. So I think that's a really important point, really at the outset, for designers to take into consideration. And finally, it's really hard to say when a value-sensitive design process doesn't work, actually, right? So it's really hard to say what are the criteria for failure. And in a certain sense, I think that's intentional, right? So we want to have processes where we don't have sort of strict, KPIs or strict criteria for success or failure when it comes to including diverse values and diverse value considerations in the design process. But that can also be a challenge, right? It doesn't always, we don't know so well how to know when it works and when it doesn't.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think, as Darian said, it's really important to keep in mind these kinds of issues. And we're going to be reflecting a lot on these issues and what they mean for these kind of ethics by design approaches as well as we go through the GuestXR project. But this has kind of given a bit of a very general introduction. And of course, today we're particularly interested in thinking about ethics in the context of AI and VR. And I mean, the issue of ethical aspects of AI is pretty hot right now, as I guess you all know. You can't really click on a news site or open Twitter or open a newspaper or anything without finding an article that has something to do with the role of ethics in AI. And as such, I mean, a huge amount of attention and energy and resources and everything has already been dedicated to the topic in recent years. I mean, so much so that Carly Kind of the Ada Lovelace Institute has talked about kind of 3 waves of ethical AI already, starting with a focus more on kind of regulations and codes of conduct, and then moving more towards kind of bottom-up reflections in a way, so more coming from the sort of scientific or researcher communities, sort of ideas around or programs built around kind of notions of fairness and accountability, interoperability. So you may have heard of kind of these acronyms FAIR and FATML. And then finally, the most recent is really this sort of shift towards what people call kind of just AI or human-centered AI. So this is really starts to get a bit closer to kind of what we're talking about when we're really talking about values and sort of building in ethically important values from a really early stage. And then I think, Darian, you're going to say something a bit about the VR ethics as well. Yeah,
I mean, I think we thought it was relevant to say something also about why we think this field is really cool, actually, and why it's so interesting. And what we're seeing with VR ethics now is there's a convergence of a lot of separate fields and a lot of questions into one theater of play, namely VR technologies and VR environments. And this makes it complex, it makes it difficult, it makes it necessary to involve, I think, as we said, a lot of interdisciplinary perspectives, but it also makes it super interesting and super fun to work in this domain. So I mean, I think we can just quickly run through some of these questions maybe, and these include questions about inclusion and accessibility when it comes to access and comfort of use. So there's a real concern within the community and also more broadly, that VR environments are built and also governed in ways that allow users, first and foremost, to feel safe, but also that the design elements on both the hardware and the software or the environment side facilitate accessibility, facilitate inclusion, so allow a broad community to make use of these technologies. And of course, we know that there are some very well-trodden data ethics issues now, which are highly relevant to discussions about virtual reality and virtual reality systems and environments. And we're going to go a little bit more into those, but already we can say, yeah, those include questions about privacy preservation and data collection, data processing and storage, really difficult question of securing consent and examining how dynamic consent processes can be used in VR environments that are themselves dynamic, and where user attitudes and user experience can shift very quickly. So this question of consent and dynamic consent is really important. There's also, and this is a big topic when you read sort of the, let's say, the media discussion, the mainstream media discussion of this, we have questions about manipulation for commercial, social, or even political motives, and also bias when it comes to choice architecture in VR environments. And this applies to, I think, all VR systems and all VR environments, but it becomes especially important when we start to talk about the activity of artificial agents or AI within VR environments. And so this is particularly relevant for us in the GuestXR project, where we want to use AI to encourage certain types of behavior or to facilitate certain types of group behavior within VR environments. And then what I think gets added to this, and I mentioned Richard Sennett a moment ago, and I think it's relatively unexplored, but quite interesting, are questions that we might bring under the umbrella of ethics of the built environment. So when we are building virtual reality environments, when we are building these immersive virtual environments, they are built environments, right? So they are environments that people will navigate, that have certain affinities for certain types of behavior, that will elicit certain types of emotion and certain types of experiences, certain types of interactions, especially. And I think we need to think very carefully about what sort of affinities for experiencing the environment and for experiencing others within the environment who we're going to share it with are built into these spaces. We think about this already, of course, when it comes to physical spaces, and now we're having to think about it more and more. And that's extremely interesting when it comes to virtual spaces. And for me, as I said, as a philosopher, cutting across all of these social, ethical, and political questions when it comes to VR are some really fundamental philosophical questions about embodiment, about presence, and also about social presence. And we'll see if we have time to get to this in the end, these questions about empathy and about how it is that we experience other people within virtual environments. So there's really like this whole brew of ethical, political, philosophical questions going into this mix, and that makes it really fascinating. But it also means that we have to sometimes be careful to separate out questions that are largely speculative, are largely anticipatory, from ones where or from questions where we can work together with developers, with scientists in other disciplines to conduct experiments or collect data, for example, ethnographic data in existing virtual reality environments. And I think that one of the things that we've learned, and that's been a great lesson so far from talking to developers, and this is really important, I think, when we're dealing with ethics in this area, is that it's relatively easy to get carried away into speculation and thinking about science fiction type scenarios. And in a way, this kind of thinking is a little bit, let's say, facilitated by some of the discussion about the metaverse that you find in the media and so forth, and also, of course, some great science fiction movies. And it is true that, you know, thinking about speculative or science fiction scenarios has an important role to play in thinking about ethics, but we really need to be clear when we go down that route. So we need to be clear, I think, about whether we're thinking about, okay, this is an question about an existing environment, existing technologies, existing, you know, interactions that are taking place, and this is really going down a speculative route, which may help us to develop and may inform our thinking, but doesn't represent necessarily the current state of the art.
Yeah, definitely. No, I completely agree. I think, like you said, that's a really important distinction that needs to be made. I think, I mean, and maybe just to sort of briefly reiterate that, as Darian said, like it's this convergence really of AI and VR that we're really particularly interested in, and that the GuestXR offers a particular window kind of onto. Because as I said, AI obviously has a pretty well-established discourse already when it comes to ethics, whereas, as Darian said, the questions around VR tend to be in a bit more of a kind of early and exploratory phase. So so we're really interested in kind of, what are the implications when these two fields converge. So in the literature review that I just put together, I sort of follow Ruth Eilert and her colleagues in using the term intelligent virtual environment to exactly refer to settings within which AI and VR are sort of converging. So as Luck and Eilert suggested in the early 2000s, research into these areas was previously, so obviously this is going back a little ways, but had previously been carried out by two pretty different groups of people with kind of different preoccupations and different interests. But of course, the two communities have a lot to work with, to learn from each other, and are also starting to work with each other more and more. Now, when we come to talking about the GuestXR project, we could even perhaps talk about intelligent virtual reality systems, which they kind of call, it's kind of a subcategory within these intelligent virtual environments. And this is really insofar as, for example, GuestXR aims to really integrate and embed AI techniques into the virtual environments, by incorporating AI algorithms into the system architecture itself. So in another paper, according to Eilert and Kovatsa, including an AI layer in a virtual environment can be beneficial in many ways. It can enable, adding problem-solving component or enhancing interactivity. These are, of course, two features that will be particularly relevant in the context of the GUEST project. And though they provide an overview of some of the issues that might arise from combining AI and artificial life techniques with those of virtual environments, their discussion largely focuses on what is technologically feasible and not what is ethically desirable. So that means there's kind of something of an open question about what an ethics of these intelligent virtual environments or these intelligent virtual reality systems, could look like. So I think, what we want to do is just to try and give you a very quick overview. I think Darian already touched on sort of some of the themes that we're going to return to, but give you an overview of some of the themes we think are particularly important in this context. So as Darian said, we've split these up and we'll kind of go through them one by one. We'll see how far we get with them, but we'll go into a little bit more detail on each of them and just sort of keep going until we think it's time, and then hopefully get some questions from you guys as well. But maybe, starting, this is one you already touched on, Darian, starting with privacy and data protection. Yeah, when it comes to privacy and data protection, could you maybe give us a bit of an idea of the sorts of issues that might arise in the context of these intelligent virtual environments and how they might differ from or perhaps build upon existing discussions about online privacy or digital rights?
Yeah, so we have a pretty clear idea now that virtual reality systems offer possibilities for what look to be a really unprecedented degree of data collection from users. And this includes physiological data about bodily movement, including eye movement, but also behavioral and social data from within these environments. For one thing, this level of data collection makes something like anonymization impossible, and it also raises various concerns. And so I think for one, there are the kind of what we might call standard data privacy risks, standard data privacy concerns. These are relating to how is the data being collected, how is it being processed and stored, is the processing and storage secure? I think really important in the case of virtual reality environments, especially because there's, we often have users who might be in a gaming situation, we have users who might be children. So there's a question of, are users aware of what data is being collected? And when they gave consent, did they have a sufficient enough understanding, i.e., what do we mean when we talk about informed consent in these contexts? And are there ways of updating that consent, right? And are there ways for a user to revoke consent if they want to at some point? What is that? What are the implications of that for their use of the system? So I think all of these are questions that are now coming up, and they're really important ones. And then we can add to this, I think, questions about user manipulation. And we know that the amount of personal data that's being collected, and also the granularity of that data, opens up possibilities for micro-targeting or for forms of nudging that users, first of all, may be unaware of, or if they are vaguely aware, they may not be comfortable with. And how we address this is going to be largely, I think, a matter of governance. But it's also going to be a question of design. And that's why I think this question of by design and by design approaches is so important. So we may have some ideas about how VR systems or environments should be regulated and governed. So we may be gaining those ideas, we may be developing these kinds of ideas. And we may want to, I think it's really important that we think about this so that we don't run into problems of technological lock-in further down the line, right? So we need to think about how these normative questions about how we should govern and regulate these systems from the beginning of the design process, right? And that's what you talked about a few moments ago. And I think, we talk about surveillance as a term that we use the term surveillance all the time these days when we talk about our privacy concerns. And in the end, I think, well, there's often the question, well, if you don't have anything to hide, you shouldn't worry about data collection. Of course, we could say, well, in the end, we all have something to hide, or at least we all have something we don't want to share. So we do want to be careful about these kinds of questions of what are we sharing in different environments. And I think that from the perspective of political philosophy, maintaining that private dimension of our lives, and now interesting is that private dimension of our lives didn't include before, that we didn't think about so much before, like our pulse rate, our eye movements, the flush of our cheeks. Well, we generally understand that maintaining some privacy, maintaining some private dimension, especially about our feelings and our emotions, is an important part of what it is to live in a democratic society. So having that possibility for privacy. So if we still feel strongly about this, we need to think about it when we build technical systems. And also, especially if those technical systems are going to be used widely or even for the provision of some public goods. And I think we're not there yet with virtual reality, but we really want to be in a situation where we can make the most of the possibilities of this technology. And I think that thinking ethically, especially about these privacy concerns from the very beginning, gives us a better shot at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think another area, so moving on to kind of another theme that we wanted to talk about a little bit today, another area that is important to address is that of accessibility, inclusivity, and safety. And I mean, this, of course, captures a number of concerns regarding the kind of different affordances and constraints of these environments. So the kind of things that they enable us to do and the things that they kind of prevent us from doing. And so the sorts of questions we need to keep in mind here really concern how we try and make these environments accessible and safe for as broad an array of users as possible, really. So, for example, although VR is often posited to be kind of an accessible medium in large, thanks to kind of its natural or somewhat intuitive interface, there's an emerging literature that focuses on how these media are actually less accessible than they may initially seem. And one of the first key issues here has to do with disability and accessible design. So, despite being framed as as having a more natural user interface in a way, in the sense that it relies on movements and on gestures of the body, it's not necessarily something that is intuitive or natural to all bodies, right? So specifically, the bodily interface for most VR devices presents accessibility issues for people with disabilities. So for example, if a system is designed, is sort of based on the assumption that the user will be in a standing position, this could lead to perspective problems. So if you're sitting down, then you may be looking over people's heads or looking up at people. There's sort of all sorts of perspective problems that could arise from that. So essentially what this means is that there's kind of a risk that these sorts of ableist or exclusionary values get encoded into the design of the technology. And as Darian said, then there's this risk that these sorts of things get locked in, right? That at some stage it becomes too difficult to change. We're too far down the line, we're too far, down the process kind of thing to be able to make any changes. So we really need to think critically, as early as we can about different forms of accessibility. And this is not only kind of to do with content accessibility or kind of interaction accessibility, but also things like inclusive representations and application diversity as well, in terms of, what kind of uses are we going to put in these applications to. And the second issue within this theme has to do with kind of, in the literature, you find quite a bit of a discussion around the sort of potentially sort of masculinized and kind of toxic sort of gamer culture that sort of unfortunately sometimes tends to go with these or appears at least to be present in the context of some VR applications. So these sorts of things often draw a lot of attention in the press, especially recently. You know, there's been things around, you know, that the metaverse already has a groping problem. You see things about, you know, sexual harassment and bullying and things going on in the sorts of VR spaces that already exist. In the literature, I found that, you know, there's quite a substantial focus really on gender-based discrimination, on harassment and bias. So harassment and discomfort really appears to be quite prevalent in social VR experiences. And I think an important question that emerges here is also, you know, how we treat so-called virtual harassment. You know, how do we distinguish between, you know, what we would call virtual and perhaps physical harassment? You know, for example, we might think about different kinds, the different ways in which VR mediates harassment. So, you know, there could be different forms of harassment, from verbal harassment, so, you know, people verbally interacting with you, to what we might call sort of physical in a way, you know, if it's to do with inappropriate touching or, you know, sort of, yeah, social distance or these sorts of issues, or more environmental, so people showing you things or changing the environment in such a way that is not appropriate. And I mean, in this context, we might also think about, you know, concerns relating to vulnerable populations. So whether that be minorities or children in particular, you know, given the possibility to remain anonymous in VR spaces, and in some VR spaces, this could present quite a challenge, obviously, when it comes to the governance of these spaces, which we'll get onto a bit more in a minute. And finally, kind of another sort of issue that comes up a little bit every now and then is how we might think about issues concerning gender with regards to the design of hardware as well. So for example, there was a media article I came across that had this kind of quite provocative title, you know, is the Oculus Rift sexist? And in the piece, a female journalist sort of talks about gender differences in terms of the kind of depth cues or kind of motion parallax, which appears to result in females experiencing nausea and motion sickness more than at least this female journalist's male counterparts. So these are kinds of, you know, the kinds of issues that we need to think about when we think about making these spaces accessible and inclusive. And I mean, then moving on to another theme that we wanted to talk about a little bit. Obviously, typically when we talk about architecture, kind of in the context of these intelligent virtual environments or VR in general, we tend to kind of focus on system architecture, so that, you know, the back end really of these technologies. But as Darian and I have been talking about a bit recently, we also need to think about the architecture of the built environment as a public space. So, I mean, then we need to kind of really ask, what does it actually mean to talk about VR as a maybe new public space? So maybe Darian, maybe you could say something about what you think the implications are of talking about these environments in this way. You know, what sorts of issues arise when we start thinking about these environments in terms of or as a new public space?
Yeah, so I think this is a pretty fascinating question about the kind of status that we give to these types of environments, depending also on their use context. So, and whether that's for social interaction, whether it's for health, or whether it's for other uses. We've already seen how the enormous growth over the last 10 years or so of social media platforms have really changed many of our ideas about what public space is. So Twitter, for example, or Facebook to a slightly lesser degree, Facebook kind of seems to go back and forth on it, have sought to portray their platforms really as the new public spaces of the digital age. But of course, these are private spaces. So they are private spaces insofar as interaction within these spaces is mediated by proprietary algorithms. The platforms themselves are privately owned. Their governance structures are determined by the companies that own them. We know all, for example, the famous example of Twitter banning the former president of the United States from using it as a platform, and that's not something that could happen in public space. So that really calls into question this notion of these kind of digital spaces as public spaces. Really, they are private spaces which are privately governed, but are used for public purposes, meaning they are used for things that are of common concern or of public concern. When we talk about virtual environments as potentially public spaces, a whole host of really interesting questions come up, I think. And these are indeed questions that have been addressed for a long time by people working on the ethics of the built environment, as I said before. There, of course, are questions about, when we talk about public space, about the functionality and the purpose of these spaces. and who has a role in determining not only the functionality and the purpose, but how certain ideas of functionality or how certain ideas of purpose are going to be expressed within these spaces, right? So there are questions about, well, is the space in the end conducive to fulfilling the role that a public space should fill? And in fact, who gets to decide about this, right? Is this something that users should have a say in? Is this something that the owners of the infrastructure should have a sort of sole responsibility for? And really now we get into questions about how these digital spaces, how these virtual spaces should be governed. And this is also a great design question in relation to virtual reality environments, right? How can these spaces be designed also in terms of the entities that are possible within these spaces? Right, so how can they be designed in ways that actually facilitate user or stakeholder engagement and perhaps eventually governance, right? So what modes we would say of stakeholder engagement, what modes of stakeholder governance are in fact most appropriate to these types of environments? And I think we're only now starting to explore these types of questions. These are really kind of political questions for a new type of political environment. And I think with these questions come other trickier ones, and these other trickier questions are maybe less speculative and more concrete in many ways. And they are questions that already apply to the very delicate distinction between public and private spaces and physical reality. But they're questions like what forms of content or behavior are permissible, and really importantly, who's making a decision about this, and how is it going to be policed? So we've seen discussions about how Meta has taken decisions about the shape and the form of avatars, about how distance between avatars is going to be regulated. And these are decisions that are taken at a corporate level, of course, involving ethicists. As a result, they would say, or in response to stakeholder concerns. But of course, we would say it's not a democratic mechanism by which these decisions are taken. So I think this is going to become a really increasingly interesting problem. There's also the question, I mean, you talked about accessibility, you talked about vulnerability a moment ago. And I think there's a question of who has liability for potential harms, either physical or emotional, that are incurred while in these environments, while using these systems. And then of course, there's the question of ownership of digital entities within VR environments, right? So I think when we talk about objects within VR environments, I think we are talking about real objects. We're talking about objects that people relate to, that have meaning for people, that you experience perceptually in different ways. And so questions about, well, who owns objects? What does it mean to own a digital object in these environments? Who has permission to curate, to construct, et cetera? These are going to become increasingly important questions.
Yeah, absolutely. No, exactly. And I think that actually nicely takes us on to one of the next themes that we were talking about, and that you and I have been talking about recently, which is another one of the very interesting areas where VR ethics can also start to overlap with other areas of study. And that really surrounds this question of political economy and governance. So we've kind of touched on some of the issues I think that arise already here, but maybe you could say a few more words about that, Darian, about sort of, some of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already mentioned some of the questions that surround the distinction between public and private space, for example. And I think everybody that we've encountered in this community agrees that some sets of norms and regulations are necessary so that we can start to think about governance structures within VR environments or within VR systems, also depending on the type of system, depending on the type of environment. But the tougher question is, of course, how can and should these environments or these spaces be regulated, and what does regulation or what does governance mean in this context? And I think this is super interesting. We can think of codes of conduct for users, we can think of codes of conduct for developers, and also increasingly for curators of these spaces. And then I think we need to think about, if we can agree that we need codes of conduct, we need to think, okay, well, what are the mechanisms that are appropriate to different types of virtual environments that we can use to develop these codes of conduct, also to maintain them and also to update them. And then, of course, what are the relevant methods of oversight going to be? Especially if you think back to concerns about surveillance, right? And we think, well, what forms of oversight are going to be relevant within these spaces? And of course, that again pertains to, well, do we consider these to be public spaces, or do we consider them to be private spaces? Because the kinds of oversight, also the kinds of sanction that we think are appropriate in private space is much different than what we think is appropriate in public space. So what this means in this context and what the implications are for governance of these virtual environments, I think is really important. And I think, we can think about this. This takes us a little bit into the speculative again, makes it a little bit fun, but I think, this question of whether these environments or how they're going to be governed, what methods of oversight are appropriate, well, they're particularly interesting in a situation where we're talking about where really the fabric of perceptual reality and the underlying infrastructure that supports that fabric is within, let's say, or is potentially proprietary. So it's potentially privately owned and controlled. And I think we'll see how this situation develops. We'll see, whether these types of environments start to be used for different types of interaction, different types of services. We'll see how these questions are dealt with.
Yeah, definitely. Well, again, I think that nicely leads us on this. We've sort of come to kind of the last theme we wanted to touch upon today. But I think, when we start to talk about kind of the uses of these spaces and kind of, what they've been sort of just how the uses have been discussed and described so far, this kind of nicely brings us on to ideas about behavior change, really, and specifically the use of artificial agents within these spaces to sort of nudge, guide, or kind of otherwise direct behavior, such as, for example, in enhancing or inducing empathy. So key questions here really include things like, how can these environments be used in a therapeutic fashion to induce behavioral change? So Darian, what would you say? I mean, so as I said, this is kind of the last theme we're going to touch upon today, and then I think we'll speak for a couple more minutes, and then we should have about 10 minutes left for questions. But maybe Darian, what would you say are sort of some of the key sort of ethical questions here regarding the sort of goal of inducing behavior change, and specifically maybe this idea that VR could potentially represent this, this notion of kind of the ultimate empathy machine?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be a little bit careful, of course, about the hype when we use terms like ultimate empathy machine. We have really no clue as to what that might mean in any case. But I do think there are there's a wide variety of different applications where there is a goal of some form of behavioral change. And a lot of that, I think, offers a lot of potential and has a lot of promise. I mean, for example, there's usage in relation to sensitizing people to the experience of homelessness or to the experience of being discriminated against because of race or because of gender. There are projects that are using VR to try to stimulate behavioral change in relation to, various behaviors related to health, related to obesity, related to various kinds of phobias. So I think there's a lot of promise, and there's a lot of really interesting applications here. However, then we have to ask, so given the degree of data that can be collected, given the granularity of data that can be collected, processed, analyzed, what are the ethical limits of nudging within VR environments, or nudging or other forms of manipulation? And of course, this links back to questions about privacy and consent. And also, I think I come back to this because I find it a particularly interesting question about ways in which dynamic consent methods could be used potentially in VR environments. You mentioned empathy, and empathy, of course, I'm a phenomenologist by training, I said at the beginning, so I'm particularly interested in this question of empathy. And yes, I think, for example, embodiment and social presence could be used to facilitate empathic relations within VR environments. But the degree to which this is possible or desirable is actually a pretty complex question, I think. And it's complex for a number of reasons. So there's a very broad philosophical question. What is empathy, right? What do we mean when we use this term empathy? And many people who use the term are using it in different ways. So we might mean it just to denote some kind of emotional contagion, right? Or it might mean, much more robust forms of perspective taking, where being empathic with somebody, having an empathic relationship with somebody, means being able to have some understanding of how it is that they are experiencing the world. So there is this idea that VR can be used to generate some understanding of other people's experience, either through changing the way one appears within a VR environment, for example. And I think this has been, the hope is this can be used especially to generate empathy with the experiences of vulnerable or of marginalized groups. On the other hand, from a sort of political perspective, there is some risk in this, right? And it has to do again with some of the ethical and political questions about empathy. And sometimes we talk about in political philosophy about empathy idolatry, right? So is empathy a kind of panacea to all of our social and political problems? And it's probably not, right? So there is a risk in relying too much on feelings of empathy as a way to build understanding. And some of that risk also comes with reinforcing existing biases and hierarchies, especially where that empathic relationship is relatively limited in the time sense. There are also well-established arguments in moral and political philosophy that certain forms of empathy, if you really feel what others are feeling, right, which can be a very powerful and very positive thing in many instances, can actually inhibit sometimes taking a more abstract understanding of certain issues, of certain, let's say, structures that are also involved with the experiences that people are having. And sometimes taking that sort of detached, that abstract position can be necessary, especially when it comes to questions about policy making. And so that's not an argument against empathy, but it is an argument, or it's a kind of warning about seeing empathy or empathy machines, empathy generation, as a kind of panacea in addressing certain policy issues. And we've seen that also with in relation to some of the VR applications as well. So we've covered a lot, I think, and we are we're left a little bit of time for questions. So I hope that we gave those of you who are here a little bit of an idea of how diverse and how interesting we think this field is, and some of the main topics that come up in that field. And if there's a little bit of time for questions, or if people have questions, I think we said you can put them on the Q&A. I don't see any open questions at the moment. But if there are questions from the panel or from anyone in the audience, we're happy to field them now, I think. If there are no questions, of course, we can all go and enjoy. It's a very sunny day here where I am in Brussels, so there's also that option as well.
Great talk, Darian. I just started talking.
Thanks, Bea.
Okay, I had to miss the middle part, but I had the beginning and the end. Fantastically important issues. And I very much agree with your carefulness about bringing empathy in here, because it's really. But then, of course, who are we to blame for this? Because VR, unfortunately, we are still at the stage where VR is credited with everything and its brother in a very unnuanced way. And I don't know of very many studies that really try to get into the mechanism of how empathy, whatever it is, might be triggered in another than an anecdotal way. I mean, what's the difference? Putting yourself in the situation of a homeless person, to what extent do you want to obtain an effect that's different from putting yourself from tourist offices using VR? I mean, you see, it's a bit more concrete seeing it in VR. But I mean, is there anything different in the kind of? Is there any reason to expect any difference in the kind of mechanisms that otherwise it remains purely anecdotal, of course?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think, I mean, that's something that we said at the beginning about the necessity to separate a little bit some of the interesting but more speculative questions from questions that we're actually able to either construct experiments to examine or to collect data. I mean, I think that, you know, the homelessness example is a really interesting one, because I experimented where I don't know what the word is. I did that scenario basically, or one of those scenarios. And what I did find, which was interesting about it, and that was the one from Stanford, was that it was successful in eliciting a kind of cognitive strain on me, right? So there was something, I came out of it quite tired and exhausted, right? And I think, I'm not sure that is, you know, the kind of empathy that most people imagine. Oh, you really know what it feels like to be a homeless person. But I did have a sense of, okay, well, there is a connection maybe that I hadn't made before between really a kind of exhaustion, cognitive strain of having to think about many different things at the same time. And then you have to have this sort of additional step of understanding, okay, well, people who are in financial difficulty or, you know, in homelessness are also having to think about, under enormous cognitive strain, right? But I think, so there's an example there of how VR can help, but I'm not sure that it's VR that does the trick, if you see what I'm saying.
Well, it's not going to be VR per se. I mean, I don't want to monopolize the discussion, by the way. And you and I will and have had time to discuss these matters. It's not just being in the VR in a passive kind of way. I mean, that's not So we still have a lot of work to do in order to understand just how it works and why it works and where it doesn't work. And so let me stop talking.
Thanks, Bea.
I have a question. So, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So, I am a social psychologist, and in social psychology, there is this notion of the power of the situation. And Phil Zimbardo shows, I mean, he has a whole book about it, where he says that, well, actually, that the most evil behaviors can be elicited in almost anyone, given, you know, the appropriate set of circumstances, context, and so on. And I think this is a very important aspect for VR. And, you know, for the ethics of VR, especially when you think about, you know, affordances that the space offers. For example, I mean, if this is a, let's say, you know, fighting, you know, kind of, you know, war game, you know, application, which is very, very popular. I mean, you know, this has some, in psychology, we know that this has some profound effects on eliciting aggression and also training people to be aggressive. This has been shown. I don't know any results from VR, but it has been shown with traditional media. So my question is about, you know, what about this long-term effects of VR on individuals? So I think, you know, the affordances is one thing, I mean, where they can permanently install new features or modify behavioral patterns, you know, opening some, basically, you know, transforming people toward the better or worse. And another thing is, you know, the long-term effects of the use of VR, right? I mean, you know, like, I mean, there are some comments about social isolation and, you know, all the effects that were so far. How would you see this, you know, from the perspective of ethics?
Dani, do you want to say something about that? Or if you have something to say,
I can. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really challenging question, Andrea, of course. I mean, I think this is always the question when we do, you know, I've been studying ideas around technology assessment and kind of anticipatory ideas around technology governance. And it's always a little bit the question of, well, we can't really predict these things, right? We don't know exactly what kinds of impacts these are going to have long term. But I think that's a lot of the reason why these sorts of methodologies like ethics by design and you know, this whole kind of idea around responsible innovation have become so popular, because it's really about, you know, how can we try and foresee different possibilities, you know, different kinds of impacts? How can we try and map as clearly and as sort of as well as we can, the different kinds of impacts and implications we can, you know, that it might have. And of course, in order to understand that, as I said, we need to talk to as many different people as possible, because, you know, if we only have one user group in mind, and we're only thinking about, you know, how they might interpret the technology or how they might use it, then of course we're not going to think about what the implications could be on a completely different user group who has different values at stake and different interests. So I think that's a lot what these kind of methodologies is trying to get around. Of course, we can't know for sure what the long-term impacts are going to be until these systems are really being used a lot more, and we can start studying, you know, the longer term impacts. Until we get to that point, it is all a bit anticipatory, but we do have these kinds of methods then in place to try and at least, you know, sort of, deal with that the best way we can, or to try and anticipate the kinds of consequences that might come with them. I don't know if you want to add anything, Darian.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree completely with what you say. I mean, I would just say that also, I mean, we do have a long history of dealing with questions surrounding precaution and the precautionary principle, right? And the relationship between, you know, whether the precautionary principle risks stifling innovation, but also questions of, I mean, I think as that discussion has become more mature as well, there are questions of what trade-offs are we dealing with, right? And are we able to try to at least characterize some of the trade-offs that we're dealing with, and try to at least envisage certain types, or try to anticipate certain types of scenarios where the precautionary principle might come in, might be applicable. So I think we do have some resources for thinking about these problems. I don't think we're there yet. We need to do the thinking, I think, especially in relation to VR, but I think there are some resources that we have, and that's one of the really interesting things, that we can draw on all these different traditions, right, when it comes to and all these different I think, you know, streams of thought when it comes to thinking about these topics, and try to make some headway.
Yeah, I very much agree with this. I would only add to this that that this long-term consequences can not only be consequences for kind of, of changing in troublesome directions, but also they may be, there is a potential of long-term changes, I would say, for more positive forms of interaction and, personal growth. And
absolutely,
I think this is, so basically a tool is powerful in whatever direction is being used, right? So I think that this long-term aspects are just important aspects of ethics in VR.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. Thank you, Andre.
Thank
you. Can I say something?
Please, Bea.
Oh, and she's gone.
Are you still with us, Bea?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so great. Yeah, go ahead.
I did something wrong. So I'm just thinking, a thought that crossed my mind. Of course, there have been in the history various ways of modifying the course of human behavior, right? But I'm just wondering to what extent it's a relevant consideration here, that here we modify the course of would possibly modify the course of human history using a different reality, using virtual reality. I mean, that's different from other kinds of behavioral engineering that have been tried out in the past, or is it just a frivolous difference?
That's a really big and great question. I mean, I think you're right. So there, of course, there's a long history of social engineering, and when we talk about, for example, urban planning, right, and consideration of the built environment, we're largely talking about a history of attempts at various forms of social engineering, also, right? Now, I think we should probably bear in mind also here that at the moment, at the state we are at the moment, I guess use of VR and VR environments is quite limited, right? I mean, I think in some of the discussions we've had with the developers, they say, well, there's a real limited amount of time that you can spend because the equipment is heavy, you get sweaty, it's annoying, et cetera, et cetera. So there's also this question about the amount of time we're spending in these environments.
Yeah.
I think on the other hand, I think that we talk about these sort of, multiplayer worlds, for example, right? And these environments that start to have their own historicity, start to have their own forms of behavior, perhaps their own norms and their own habits, which exist in a kind of parallel way to our physical interactions. That's, I mean, how those two interact is, I think, going to be an increasingly interesting question. I don't know if that's what I think that's what you were asking about, right?
No, what did strike me was that on this occasion with VR, we are actually modifying people's behavior using a virtual world. But now I'm listening to you, it occurs to me that, of course, the promise of heaven was also a way of modifying people's behavior by talking about a not real world. So I don't know, this is worth thinking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. So definitely worth thinking about. Absolutely. Thanks. Great. Timothy, should we?
Yeah, we're just a few minutes over time.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your time. And thank you for staying just a few minutes extra to keep that discussion going.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for the talk. I found it fascinating. It was great to hear some more of the things that Mel mentioned in his first talk, kind of just expanded upon. So thanks very much to both of you, Darian, Dani. Thanks to everyone that joined us today. And sorry, Darian, were you?
No, and thanks to our GuestXR colleagues also for the great feedback and comments. That was really helpful. Really,
great.
So a lot to think about going forward. I'm looking forward.
Brilliant.
All
right. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Like I say, hopefully the recording will be available afterwards, but we'll just catch up with everyone first. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dani.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.